He has had a long and distinguished history studying human factors and human beings' medical issues in space. I know a lot more about Larry than he knows because I work with two of his extraordinary offspring who are space scientists, Elliot Young and Leslie Young. So I could tell stories, but I'm not going to because we want to hear what he has to say. So, Larry.
Your change was good.
Well,
there's some things missing.
Everything's missing.
All right.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm grateful for your good taste in not telling the stories, because Elliot and Leslie told me something about you as well. This is the scientist version of mutual assumption. Okay. Well, I have order envy, right? Dave Morrison talked about problems dealing potentially with the population of the world. 10 to the 9th to 10 to the 10th people. We talked about billions and billions. I'm going to talk about 10 to the 2 to 10 to the 3 in terms of exposure. But since Kristen was good enough to introduce the issue of astronaut health and safety, I feel comfortable in doing that. And the ethical issues are as important and as complex for treating people who are doing space exploration as they are, I believe, for protection of our planet or other planets, or at least that's the reason I think that Bob invited me out here today. Exploration and dealing with humans in long is, as I try to illustrate here, not a new problem. And I suspect that some of the same issues that we're discussing today were thought of in the days of the great voyages of exploration, as they will be when we return to the moon and go on to Mars. But in both cases, we're talking about humans taking risks for perceived benefits. I'm going to discuss with you three constituencies today which relate to the problems of human health and risk-taking. The astronauts, which again was introduced very, very nicely before lunch, before Kristen, by Kristen, and those are the ones we're most familiar with. The issues of the hazards, particularly as we go from the low Earth orbit to return to the moon, and especially the exploration class missions which will go on to Mars. And furthermore, the issues of astronauts as participants in life sciences experiments. We tend to think of this mostly in terms of the health hazards to the astronaut, and I want to talk more about the astronaut as a member of a scientific team. I'm also going to talk about the ethical issues associated with scientists involved in doing experiments on space missions, and in particular, the relationship between the scientists who are principal investigators on life sciences experiments and the astronauts who are both their hands and brains in space performing the experiments and also often the subject of their experiment. And finally, I'll have a few words to say about space tourists, the third class of explorers. The effects, and I eliminated quickly all of the slides that I had on radiation since that was covered so nicely before lunch. And I'm going to talk about the kinds of health hazards that are associated with the effects of microgravity and isolation rather than radiation on the human body. And again, I think that if we could have a speaker this morning, assume that we all knew the Drake equation, I can assume that you all know the physiological effects of microgravity and not spend any time. How true is that? Is this familiar to most of the people in here? Only about half. Okay, that gives. So I'll reduce a semester into about a minute. When you are launched into space, low Earth orbit, go into orbital flight, the first thing that you would find, in fact, temporally, is the likelihood of motion sickness due to the unusual stimulation that is present to the vestibular system, where the direction of the down no longer means anything in terms of pull on the otolith organs, and there is a conflict between one portion of the vestibular organs and another portion of the vestibular organs. That conflict resulting in a particular kind of motion sickness called space motion sickness. It is adapted to over typically 1 to 3 days in space, and it can have a unexpected after effect upon landing or back on Earth or on the surface of another planet. Treatable with an intramuscular injection, but the long-term effects of adaptation are still an issue. Also of concern early in the flight is the effect of decrease in blood volume, decrease in red blood cells, and cardiovascular deconditioning. Stand here. Now there is a tendency for blood to move away from my head and chest and down toward my abdomen and legs. And if I lie down, there is a shift in the other direction. Well, going into space, there will be at first a shift of blood volume up toward the upper body, up toward the filling of the veins in the neck. This is detected. The excess volume is lost both by reduction in thirst, increase in urination. You're down about a liter after a day, leaving you in excess of red blood cells, a high hematocrit. That also is detected and reduced both by a reduced production of red blood cells with a reduction in erythropoietin in the bones, and also a selective killing of those red blood cells that were produced in the last 10 days or so before launch. Finally, the cardiovascular system, which normally acts very nicely to changes in posture. So when you go from lying down to standing up and have a hydrostatic pressure head, which is associated with the vertical distance between your heart and your brain, that reflex, in fact, is challenged because it is no longer required in space, and there is a whole complex of activities normally associated with keeping blood pressure sufficient to supply blood to the brain, which no longer function as well when you are in space in the zero-G environment, but they lead to all kinds of problems when you return back to Earth. So that if we were all in space for a week, came back and had to do nothing but stand up in front of an audience, we wouldn't be able to do it for the required 10 minutes without 75% of us becoming pre-syncable and tending toward fainting. So that's one of the major issues, cardiovascular deconditioning. The muscles that normally support the body in space undergo atrophy and a change of their muscle type. They switch from slow twitch fibers towards the fast twitch fibers, and it takes some time after return to space to get the muscle mass back. Of most concern for most of us in terms of the microgravity effects is the effect of microgravity on the bone. You're no longer walking around having impact loading, which gives you a periodic compression on the bone, leading to the healthy process of rebuilding bone through the taking calcium from the bloodstream, rebuilding up new bone, and as old calcium is removed from this living tissue. That is severely impacted. My friend Victor has spent a good part of his career studying the mechanisms for it and the ways of overcoming it, the bone demineralization. Let me say that is a big unsolved problem. Right now we don't really have a way of protecting astronauts against long-duration deconditioning, losing about 0.5% per month of bone mass. Yes, David?
You mixing up here the questions of adaptation to space and then the problems of readaptation
Yes, I am.
to the ground.
Yes, I am. I'm putting them all into one slide. Because some of the ones that are adaptation to space, which are perfectly fine in here, lead to a problem when you return to Earth. Okay,
Are
so
there any of those that really affect your ability to operate in space other than the motion sickness?
no. No, we adapt very nicely to space, but we're in big trouble when you adapt, and it would be sort of a shame after going to all that expense of going to Mars if you couldn't do any work on the Martian surface, wouldn't it? Or fractured a bone and couldn't recover. Okay, so these are the typical list of the issues that one deals with, human health issues in space travel. I couldn't cross that out in time, but I'm not going to talk about it. And then finally, the psychological stress of living for 3 years with close friends in your bathroom. Okay, so when we get to some of the ethical issues, that actually was a quote from the first American payload specialist. Was at the time one of my graduate students. I said, this is a man named Byron Lichtenberg. I said, well, what was it like? And that was his answer. Okay, so one of the questions is, having recognized that there is a risk associated with space flight beyond the risk of the explosion of the solid rocket boosters or the loss of heat shield, the question is how much risk is allowable or how much risk is acceptable, and are they different between a professional astronaut and a space tourist, an issue that David Livingstone was referring to before lunch. For the professional astronaut, one would have to say that the risk one should take depends upon the benefits of a mission. And if the benefits of a mission are zero, then there's very little justification for taking any but negligible risks. But another issue is the nature of the health deterioration. Is it reversible? A number of us will do things which we know are bad for our bodies, but we can recover from them. A number of us would be reluctant to undergo certain kinds of exposures which would in fact be irreversible. And of the ones that I've mentioned there, bone loss may be irreversible in the sense that when bone regrows, it will grow into the same circumferential thickness that it did prior to the space exposure. For the space tourist, in which presumably the benefit is primarily, if not exclusively, to the enjoyment of the tourist and the amusement of his family, the question is, should the tourist be therefore completely free to make an informed choice about an acceptable risk? Given the information about the risk that's being taken, should the tourist have any other constraints than the professional astronaut? And I'm going, like most of the things I'm going to do this afternoon, I'm going to raise the questions rather than give the answers. I think a purpose of the workshop is to get us to bring these up as topics for discussion. But again, the informed choice is an essential element in that question. Okay, now those are for the space travelers. How about the people who are involved in the scientific experiments, and what are their ethical issues above and going into space as a traveler? Should an astronaut who is going to be a subject in an experiment be free to withdraw from the experiment? I'm going to deal with that at some length. For scientists who are involved and have approved experiments, presumably in our country supported by NASA or in Europe supported by the European Space Agency or the Russian Space Agency, what can they expect will be the obligations of the subjects? Can they expect that the subjects that they've trained will give them full cooperation once they have signed the informed consent, or must they be faced with the uncertainty associated with subjects who are free to withdraw from an experiment at any point? I've incorporated in here a number of slides that were made available by Dr. Chuck Selwyn, who's recently retired from NASA, and he prepared these in his role as chairman of the IRB, the Institutional Review Board at JSC. The question of the rules and regulations for astronauts going into space in terms of their health hazards have been developed through a series of publications and committees going back at least to 1966. And I frankly don't, although I was distantly associated with Apollo, I don't remember what was involved with informed consent, nor am I sure that was even a concept that was in place in the 60s. The NIH published its policy for subject protection in 1966, and this is the first of two slides, which I will not go through in any detail, in which the issues of privacy, the issues of informed consent came through, and the very, very important Belmont report, which I commend to those of you who are unfamiliar with the issue of human subject participation, issued in 1979, deals not only with the Tuskegee experience that Kristen referred to, but a host of other very important and rather shocking misuses of human subjects. NASA first published its so-called Red Book, which is guidelines for investigators and also rules and regulations for the astronauts in 1991, and in 1984. By 1991, the entire federal government came under the regulations referred to as the Common Rule. The Common Rule, which I'll touch on a little bit more, is a common rule across all federal agencies must do to respect the rights and protect the health and safety of human subjects. The Red Book has been revised frequently, and I'll quote from certain parts of it in a few moments because it is important. And very importantly, it must contain consent forms, and the consent form, as Kristen said, has to fulfill a number of criteria. It has to be voluntary, it has to be clear, it has to be signed by somebody who is competent, and has to reveal all of the risks and so forth. So we're up to 1999, and I will get you a few examples of some of the issues that are dealt with in the Red Book that deal with our subject of our workshop today, namely ethical issues in space travel. And at this point, let me just digress to say what a marvelous world it is. When you and I were young people in school, we had to read books. And then my students only have to read PowerPoint bullets. And now, those of us who are too tired to read PowerPoint bullets only have to read the stuff in red. So it's gotten really easy. I hesitate to think where evolution is taking us next. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the issue of confidentiality and privacy. If you are performing an experiment for the Johnson Space Center, for NASA, involving human subjects, you have to propose and have approved a data sharing plan, and in that data sharing plan is a plan to protect the privacy of medical data. This has been the case for some 20 years or so in spaceflight experiments. We're now much more familiar with it as patients and in a hospital now that HIPAA is the law. And you know that you cannot go to a hospital and find out about somebody's medical data unless you are the next of kin so designated. So the confidentiality and privacy that's spelled out in the JSC Red Book on maintaining privacy of biomedical data establishes the policy of protecting the privacy of the data from the flight crew members during these voluntary experiments. And it says that if you are publishing it, no data can be attributed to an individual will be publicly released without the consent of the subject. And the subject consent is often difficult to get. I'll go into some of the reasons why that is the case in a few moments. It means that you do not disclose the personal identifier. No longer do we publish data with the initials of the subject. Well, that's okay, because the initials of the subject are typically of no interest to the scientist unless the scientist wants to look at the correlation between that particular subject's responses on a cardiovascular test and that particular metabolic balance, which may have been published in another paper. So the loss of the ability to identify the subject, in fact, is, in some cases, a threat to the investigator. And typically this is worked out in advance by having an agreement among investigators in which one points out what data must be shared, and then the non-disclosure of personal identifiers can be kept. Secondly, you have to show that when you do publish your data, there is sufficient pooling of data to preclude determining an individual's identity. Now, the situation at this point is if I want to fulfill all of the requirements of the reviewers of the journal to which I'm submitting data, and I want to point out the probability or the extent of motion sickness of which was one of my areas of study, the extent of motion sickness of a subject, the reviewers would like to know more about the subject: age, gender, perhaps height and weight. So I put that in. I don't identify the subject. Duration of the mission, that's certainly important. Now, it doesn't take being a rocket scientist, thank you. I love it. I love to be able to say, yes, I am a rocket scientist, and if only your problems were that easy. Right? Anyway, it doesn't take a rocket scientist then to look at the pooled data and say, let's see, I'm looking for who would have been a 5'6" woman on a 14-day flight in 1987. That's not hard to find. And suddenly, the personal identification issue is gone. So that's a real conflict. It is an ethical issue that we face.
Excuse me.
Yes.
If the subjects are willing to let their identity be released,
If the
does that take
subject,
care of it?
if the subject is willing to let the identity be released, then we may identify them. Victor was on that committee for a while. I think you know that. That's correct, isn't it?
Correct.
But
So in principle, astronauts could agree.
in principle, they could. In fact, none do at this time. Almost none do. Most astronauts, in my experience, are loyal to the Corps, and they say to the CORPS as well as CORE, and they do not allow their names to be used on data. It has gone to so far as having astronauts refuse to have the downlinked echocardiogram available on any of the monitors that could be looked at by anyone else in the control room, because that's private medical data. Silly, but a fact of life. Okay, now let's back up to prior to the flight. Your astronaut is, because you're doing a biomedical experiment, is going to go through some rather thorough medical evaluations. And in the course of that medical evaluation, suppose you find that there's something a little strange about this astronaut's physiological response. Now, you're a scientist. You're not the physician. What is the policy toward, what should be the policy toward the use of that data? It is not to be used, the data that you have in your protocols will not be used to determine the aeromedical certification of crew members. So if I find that someone has something which looks to be strange, unless I have any reason to think that it's life-threatening, I may not reveal it. I may, in all good faith, tell the astronaut what I found, and it's for her to see what has to be done about it. But unless it's life-threatening, it's not revealed. And if it is life-threatening, then it can be used for medical evaluation necessary for an appropriate follow-up care for the individual for aeromedical certification. Now, this may seem very strange, but what is it that astronauts live for? The next flight. So they really don't want to have anything come up that would disqualify them. If you remember the right stuff, it's true. The flight dock is the astronaut's enemy. Okay, let me hit a few of the unique issues that make space flight and space travel in terms of the ethical issues different than some other investigations. Avoidance of coercion. That's part of the common rule. You can't coerce a subject into being your experimental subject. However, if it's made clear that if you sign up for this assignment, you will be expected to be a subject of experiments, you damn well better accept or you're not going to get that assignment. Is that coercion? Dubious. It is potential during the selection. It's potential during the selection to become an astronaut. It's the potential during flight assignments. I served for one mission in the astronaut office. I was a payload specialist on Space Lab Life Sciences 2. I ended up as the backup while my roommate went up and did a much better job than I would have done in space through all of this selection, assignment to a flight and so forth. And you really are strongly inhibited from saying at these stages, no, I don't think that's an experiment in which I want to be a subject, even though it may be one which is potentially dangerous. As subjects, remember you're working, if you're a career astronaut, working for the very agency that is conducting the experiment. And we'll deal with this question of withdrawing. What if the astronaut says, yeah, I'll be a subject, sure, stick me where you want. The most threatening experiment on the flight I was referring to was an indwelling cardiac catheter. Then it may not seem like such a good idea. To what extent can the subject withdraw? Well, you know what the common rule says, you're free to withdraw without penalty at any time. Privacy and confidentiality, I talked about the small number of subjects in known subjects give you a high visibility. The issue of misconduct or anomalous data. What if we have a subject who hides the fact during the flight selection that one is taking medication to deal with a certain medical problem? And it had been done on the outside. Maybe it was a violation of violation when the original application was filled out. Nevertheless, what do we do with that subject if this medication is going to interfere with the validity of the experiment? We want to look at, in space, something which is a little different than in other biomedical experiments, much more carefully at the risks of benefits. Risks and benefits. The experiments may not benefit the individual subject. In fact, they're almost sure not to benefit the individual subject, the kinds of experiments that we're doing, but they're being done in order to benefit the future pool of astronauts. Well, a lot of the things we're doing now, illustrated by the subject on a treadmill, are to try to develop countermeasures against the kind of deconditioning, which at this point would make it terribly dangerous to go on the kind of long Mars missions that we discussed yesterday. So you have somebody taking a risk with no benefit to himself or herself. They will be participating typically in multiple simultaneous protocols, and it's not always evident the extent to which we just had I will divert a little bit. Victor was with me when we reviewed the results of a major multidisciplinary study that was just conducted at the University of Texas Medical Branch, in which we put people to bed for 21 days. And the experimental subjects were spun around on a centrifuge for an hour a day. The controls were left were left in bed. Bed rest is the best ground analog we have to the effects of weightlessness. The fact is we were doing multiple simultaneous protocols, and one of my colleagues was measuring muscle strength, another one was measuring the muscle characteristics from a muscle biopsy that made it painful to really do a maximum voluntary contraction, and there was an interaction between these two. So you've got the separate issue of multiple simultaneous protocols. When we're doing an experiment on orbit, we do not have a full hospital present. And so the lack of medical facilities makes one think even further about what you're doing that could possibly injure your subject. The subject, on the other hand, is worrying about medical disqualification. If something is done to him in space or in preparation which is going to hurt him and make him unqualified for a future space flight, he's not going to be very happy to participate in it, even if he signed the informed consent. And then these exacerbating conditions of reduced medical capabilities can increase the risks. And then finally, probably the unique but most onerous is the following. If you accepted the risk of space flight, for goodness sakes, you're certainly accept the smaller risk of this experiment. Now, what is the risk of space flight? You remember the brouhaha that was made after the Challenger accident about, oh, poor Krista McAuliffe, the New Hampshire school teacher in space, she didn't know what she was getting into. She didn't know how risky this would be. NASA was at fault for taking a, quote, civilian, a teacher astronaut. Of course she knew what she was getting into. And I went down there a few years later. It was very clear to us that this was a risky business, that we were looking at about a 1% risk of not returning from a space flight. And we as individuals had to make an intelligent decision as to the risk-benefit analysis, the benefit not only to our own selves and our ego, but the benefit in terms of what we would be contributing. But you are going to be, 5 minutes? You're going to be faced with this question of contrasting the risk of the space flight with the risk of the... There are multicultural issues. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this and only say that the Russians do it differently. They pay astronauts to be subjects in experiments. They penalize them for not getting things done. When we get into long-duration bioethical issues of long-duration flight, we are aware that the health status will probably change significantly during this three-year mission. It's likely that medical treatment will be done in flight, and it's hard to do it when you're on Mars. We have more psychological stressors on a long-duration mission. We are dealing with the time delay issue that was discussed earlier in the week, and there is no coming home. I mean, there's no coming home early from Mars the way there is from the moon, and there's no what we do on the space station and we'll do on the moon in the case of a medical emergency is you stabilize and transport. Stabilize the subject, and in most cases that's sufficient. Transport them back to the hospital. Here are some of the special health threats that we will be looking at as we go in through the vision of the Moon and Mars issue, and I think these are probably all clear just from the bullets. These are some of the ethical policy issues that we will have to deal with. We'll have trained health care professionals, but that's hardly the same as having a full hospital cadre. And we talked about radiation a little bit earlier. So what do you do about it to try to go and satisfy the needs both of the scientific community trying to push the state of the art a bit further and protect the rights of the travelers? Medical screening, and here's an interesting one. If we develop, as we're almost sure to do, genetic screening to eliminate high-risk health issues, is that appropriate? You know, if two of us are equally qualified in terms of training and we're all healthy, should one of us be eliminated from the possibility of going to Mars because of genotyping?
Yes.
Yes, I think so too, but there are those who think not. Mandatory appendectomy? I will tell you that before the flight that as a backup, I had to be ready to go until the last moment. They took out a problematic wisdom tooth, and then the dentist said, "Well, let's take them all out." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we don't want to have any problems if you're in flight." I said, and he said, "But Larry, it's free. The government's paying for it." I said, "Well, they're my teeth." That's literally true. I only let him take one out. Okay, I think we, the other, oh, maybe we ought to fly a single gender crew, it's been suggested, to minimize the complications of crew cohesion and performance. And that's a long and complicated subject. I'm against that solution, but it is one that has been.
Is it a solution at all?
To fly a single. There's my own observations, David, is that the mixed gender crews are better crews. That they are better behaved. That there is a. Let me just leave it at that. So I think that they're better off. However, on a long duration mission, you run into all the issues of sexual behavior, couples, and so on. Okay, the Johnson Space Center has provided some guidelines. I'll give you a few quotes from some of the key ones here. What happens if the investigator violates this common rule? His protocol may be suspended, and the NASA Red Book calls for sanctions for non-compliance, loss of investigator privileges and funding. Sanctions include reprimand, suspension, or termination of employment, and that has happened. What if something comes up in the case of the investigation that makes the crew members' participation in that particular experiment an unacceptable risk? The crew surgeon can prohibit the member from participating in it. That may be reasonable, but where does that leave the investigator? We've talked, I think, enough about the pooling of data, and I just wanted to point out that although that sounds like a good idea in principle, it is in fact threatening to the scientific advances unless there is an opportunity for qualified investigators to have access to astronaut health and life sciences data. There are procedures in place for them, but they have been awkward. This just refers back to the common rule that we're all living under, and I'm just trying to rush through this so as not to overstay the time. I think you're all familiar with the Nuremberg process following World War II, and among other things, the Nuremberg Code states that the degree of risk should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. That is, I think, a good guideline, which is not sufficiently stressed in the common rule. Look carefully at about what it is you're trying to accomplish, either for the individual subject or for those who will benefit in the future. Subjects may withdraw participation at any time, is what it says in the common rule. If it's in flight, then the next thing you have to consider is if a subject says, I don't want to do this, after it's already been assigned to a flight, but still on the ground, and the subject supposedly can withdraw from any time, what are the conditions in which that should be allowable, and what do you do about it? The Institutional Review Board first has to determine whether the experiment is part of the central location of the mission, or merely an add-on, a detailed scientific objective. You then have to go through all of these other hoops, in this case, of a subject who wants to withdraw from an experiment. Was the subject completely informed? Did he or she formally consent in writing? Can one verify that there was no substantial change in the protocol? Well, we always change the protocol somewhat, but is it substantial? Has there been any new interim scientific information which has surfaced indicating that the initial protocol presents more than a minimal risk? If and only if all of those are deemed to be true, withdrawal from research may result in removal of that individual from the mission, taking a crew member off a mission. Determination of whether that all of those have been carried out is up to the IRB. And finally, this withdrawal shall not influence the career opportunities. Okay, now what about the PI? I told you that he or she can have the research activity suspended or terminated, other appropriate remedies and sanctions. Okay, so that's two of the three communities about which I have something to say. The issue of ethics in dealing with astronauts in space, and ethics dealing with principal investigators who are using these astronauts as subjects. I just want to say, in closing, a few words about who gets to fly in space, because we are entering a new era, have entered a new era with Spaceship One and the X Prize. The current situation in terms of at least orbital flight, who gets to fly in space, military test pilots, mission specialists who are typically MDs or PhDs, who in fact have to trade their careers. None of my friends who have become mission specialist astronauts have really been able to go back to their old career, whether it was as a university professor or as a practicing doctor. It's because you're taking 10 years doing something else. And dignitaries, we have Saudi princes, we have teachers, so we have senators and so on. And payload specialists, which is what I was, were brought in for a brief an exposure for 1 or 2 missions and are now a thing of the past. They don't exist any longer in the space station era. And we have space tourists. Who are the space tourists at this time? The people with more than a little loose change. Okay. Currently, if you have a spare $20 to $25 million and are in good health, you can go and see my friends at Space Adventure, and they'll line you up with a flight to the space station aboard a shuttle, aboard a Soyuz. Okay? In the future, commercial space tourism is hot. Dave Livingstone knows much more about this than I do, but there are many, many, many firms getting into the business of selling suborbital flights, orbital flights, around the moon flights, a space hotel, lunar orbit tours, and other fascinating subjects. I'm just not going to go into it in these few minutes. But there is more and more opportunity, and they will be at a lower cost than this, but it's not clear still how you or I are going to be able to go on it. It depends a great deal on the success in developing alternate safe flight vehicles. What about the taxpayers? What about you and me? You know, let's see, April 15th is this weekend, isn't it? So we should be about paying our taxes, and NASA is getting a little less than 1% of our money. What are we getting back for it? Well, I'm getting a lot back for it because they've supported my career very nicely, but what is the average taxpayer getting back for his contribution? And does he or she have the right to say, gee, the really fun thing about space is space travel, why can't I go? Well, it's not conceivable that we can take everybody. This demand will be high despite the high risk, although I wonder how it's going to change after our first space tourist. The true costs of sending people into space will remain excessive, but I believe that we need to present the chance to fly for everybody, for you and me. And based upon the experience I had when I was a payload specialist, I spent 2 years at the Johnson Space Center being trained on science, on shuttle operations, on safety, on underwater activities, trying to simulate some of the weightless effects on a centrifuge, on zero gravity flight. I had a ball. I learned a great deal. I was very, very happy with the experience, and I did not feel that somehow I was misled when I didn't get a chance to fly. So based on that, I think that we would be advised to consider, and I'm not the first person who has talked about other ways of getting people into space. I would propose that we sell tickets. I'm not sure who we is here. One sells tickets for a fee that's comparable to a big trip, a $5,000 or $10,000 trip, the kind of thing you might use for a cruise comparable to going to Antarctica. All the participants would get 1 to 2 weeks of space training, including parabolic flight, underwater simulation, centrifuging, all of what I used to call fun at government expense. You would train on the spacecraft systems, get some classroom exposure at labs in space physiology, learn about Earth observations, what it means when you see certain characteristics we window. All who wish may get the space screening physical. Well, I must tell you, that's not a lot of fun. And then finally, one or more of the cohort that was brought down would be selected for space flight, either by a competition or by a drawing, depending to some extent on the legality that Dave was starting to educate me about. The remaining cohort participates in the space flight by having ground assignments, and there are a host of really useful things, not made-up activities to do on the ground, and then everyone goes home as a proud space cadet with more than a cap.
Baseball fantasy camps.
Like baseball, yes, baseball fantasy camps, but way better, way better.
Your 10K doesn't come close to paying for that.
Make it a reality TV show.
Yeah.
Well,
Make a lot more money, and
there
you
have-
don't even need to pay the 10K.
You know, David is really the expert on this, on the financing of it. But let's just, and the 10K business really gets down to how many people you have in the cohort. Okay, so as we've gone from the age of exploration to vision, the vehicles have changed, Should the ethics change too? I would claim they will. I would claim that the value of human life in the days of Columbus was perceived to be less than we perceive it in the current era. Questions?
Over here.
Looks like I have the microphone. I'd like to ask you a question about NASA and sex.
NASA and SEDS.
And sex.
Oh, sex.
Sex.
You may ask ahead, but you won't get an answer.
Yeah, sex in space.
Yeah.
Let's take as our example flight to Mars. This is somewhere between 2.5 and 6 years, depending how you do it, right? It's a minimum of 2.5 years, correct?
It depends on how you do it, but yeah, 2 to 3 years.
And you brought this up in passing when you talked about single gender crews. How much thought has NASA given to this question of whether they're going to ask people to be celibate or to amuse themselves, so to speak, for 2.5 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, or whether there's going to be some kind of provision and thought about this? This is obviously a significant part of the psychology of space travel and isolation and everything else. And then what I find particularly interesting about this is that the astronauts might be able to come up with some kind of accommodation. You hear stories about how it works over in Iraq with people who find themselves in distant places, and they reach some kind of accommodations for a discrete relationship under discrete circumstances. But I'm wondering, first, if NASA has thought much or done much research on this point, and second, have they thought much about the politics or the cultural dimension of this? Because we do live in a Christian nation. Many of our compatriots have rather conservative attitudes about sexual matters.
In my experience, which is largely as a university professor doing NASA-sponsored research, and then 2 years, 1 year out here at Ames, and then 2 years at the Johnson Space Center, I have never heard a serious, open, official discussion of the issue. The closest that that's come to it that I've come across has been in the discussion of the potential crew mix for the long-duration exploration mission, and that's where one has had discussions of flying couples to deal with it. So I wouldn't say that it's ignored, but it certainly doesn't get high visibility. I wonder if Dr. Schneider has anything to add to this.
Well, and as we ask
I mean, you're certainly correct that it is a legitimate question, but I just am not aware of any discussion of it.
And do you think it's much of a problem if is it realistic for NASA to contemplate a mission to Mars without dealing with the sexual aspects of 3, 4, 5 years of space travel?
Yes. I think that's the least of their problems.
Let's hear from Victor if he's willing to say something.
Thank you, Larry. This is a concern, but as Larry mentioned, it's a relatively minor concern right now because we're not doing that for 2 or 3 years missions or long-term missions in which we expect someone has to have sex. We know that it will happen for the dangers of space. We've made preparations so that astronauts may avail themselves of the services or putting away sperm or eggs as necessary. We have looked at the analog situations, which the best have been a use of Antarctica and those places that have wintering over with no hope of rescue. And in all those places, there always have been behavioral problems associated with sex. Are we doing research on sex per se? We don't think that we need to do that right now because that's being done in terrestrial medicine. Would we do that if there was some unique feature? The answer would be yes.
Yeah, I would hope that we don't spend the time entirely discussing this question because it's one in which I have nothing more to contribute.
Right. And I just wanted to make a quick comment, since I have the microphone, on David's question of what those potential illnesses that are related to space travel itself, and that's muscle atrophy. What happens is the steady state for muscle atrophy is greater than that necessary to do EVAs, and so that some astronauts have not been able to fulfill their missions. Cardiac arrhythmias seem to be occurring a little bit more frequently. Viral reactivation of those viruses like herpes and other things like that reactivate. People probably have a significant portion of them get metabolic syndrome, that is insulin resistance, because they maintain about the same body weight, yet because of the muscle loss, they actually have increased adipose. There's back pain that's associated with both renal stone formation and spinal nerve entrapment. Anemia, people in space, because of the fluid shifts, don't seem to make red blood cells. If you're testing them in any way, either for research or for routine blood testing, they don't remake their red blood cells, and so they become anemic. Vitamin D deficiency has occurred because of the lighting situation. Constipation and urinary retention because of the lack of gravity, and obviously the behavioral health problems, which probably are not directly related to microgravity, but to the space flight.
Right.
Why,
Thank you, Victor. Are we still willing to go? Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I almost become convinced that we were better suited for space than for the ground.
Especially for people.
Oh, I just wanted to say we shouldn't presume that just because it's a single gender that there won't be sex. As we've learned it with incarcerated populations in Navy submarines.
That was really neat for that presentation. I had three quick questions. One, how much time in space before bone loss density becomes an issue? Second, you gave the impression that almost all astronauts are involved in some kind of physiological experiment as well. I'd like to know what percentage are involved in some kind of experimentation. And third, you indicated that astronauts really want to, they do not want to give permission for about their experiment on them to become public. Why is that?
Okay. I may turn to Victor for help on the bone question. The general number that's bandied about is that you lose something in excess of 5% of 0.5% of your bone mass per month. So a year in space, or let's say 2 years in space, you're down 12%. That starts to get dangerous in terms of increased fracture loss and the reduced ability to withstand the kinds of loads that you might be getting if you're walking around in an EVA, doing EVA, or on the surface of Mars. So we don't worry about it too much in terms of a shuttle duration flight of 14 days. Space station currently nominal 6 months. You certainly do see bone loss, which is not overcome by the kinds of treadmill running that we see in space. For missions in a year, it's a very serious threat. Would you agree with that, Victor?
In general, the major difference is that if we look at older people who are osteoporotic, they really need to lose 25 to 50% of their bone mineral or their bone density. But if you take a young, healthy astronaut who is normally very, very active, if they lose 5 or 10%, that may be enough to have a fracture. And returning astronauts, even for shuttles, that 37% of them have sprains, strains, and fractures after a space flight.
Okay. Now, your second question about the percent of subjects who are participants in life sciences experiments in the space station era, must be close to 100%, because one of the major goals of the remaining experiments that still can be done on the station are to use the subjects as subjects on the few remaining experiments that we're able to conduct. So it's a large number. The kind of experiments that I have been involved with were missions on which the primary core experiments were life sciences, and then all of the science crew participated. Typical shuttle flight, there would be 4 people in the back room doing experiments, 3 people up front flying it. Your other question is about why the resistance to having the medical data identified. It's really silly. indefensible in my view, and yet it has become a pattern in which one would try to go and stand up for the good of the astronaut corps by taking a uniform stand of saying we will not allow anybody's data to be identified because that might be it's personal data. It might be used in some way to go and discriminate against this individual in terms of future job opportunities. You know, in a sense, it is not that from the HIPAA regulations that we face whenever we're hospitalized. The difference being that the HIPAA information would not otherwise be available to the scientific and medical community for the benefit of future patients. This data would be available to them, and I must say I feel that I'm in favor of the pooling of data. I'm in favor of the restricting the publication of data which can be identified by individual subjects to the general population. However, I think that qualified users who will respect its use in terms of their analysis and their future publications should have access to it.
Kristen's had her hand.
Yeah. Real simple follow-up question. Do these astronauts get something like Fosamax to protect their bones, and does it help? And if not, why not?
Well, my information is a little bit old. When I was there in the 90s, no, they did not. There has been an increase in the use of the abandronates, which is the class of drugs that are used for treating osteoporosis, particularly in postmenopausal women. There have been some experiments begun with that, and I know that there was a project to do some in-flight tests. Again, I'll call on Victor, who's still with the agency, to tell me if we're going ahead with that. This was with the abandronate studies.
Because of the risk-benefit ratio, almost everything that we do that's for healthy people, we do as a research project. And if a drug works, it obviously has side effects. And so the use of bisphosphonates is a research project and is being considered for future as a research project. Since even though the bisphosphonates have been used for 15 years, new side effects are discovered all the time. And as Larry mentioned, every time you discover a new side effect, you have to go back and tell the astronauts. And the usual thing is the pendulum. When the new side effects come out, it's the world's worst thing, and it's not for some time until you get perspective on that.
Two quick comments. One is Dr. Rowe has been trying to do legitimate medical research on the Apollo 15 flight for lunar dust toxicity. So he finally went and got a FOIA request for Jim Irwin's medical data. And it was highly redacted, but he got enough of the medical data to publish part of his work in a reviewed journal. He cannot get Dave Scott because he is still alive. And NASA will not help him find out where in California Dave Scott lives or get in touch with him or do anything to get the data. And his research is really legitimate. So every time Dr. Rowe tries to move to figure out how to get his data, which he really needs for this toxicity study that he's doing, there's a roadblock in his path unless he can actually individually contact Scott, which is now what he's trying to do. The other thing I was just going to...
If Dr. Rowe contacts me, I will try to tell him who to get in touch with
okay,
for the legitimate use of the.
Yeah, I will. And
not that I control it, but I know some of the.
Right. The first part of his study is just published in the British Interplanetary Journal, so he's definitely legitimate. To just add some insight on the sex and space issue, Laura Woodmansee wrote a book called Sex and Space, and it's an okay book, and there's nothing in it that is disrespectful or bawdy or anything like that. It's fine. And the first thing that happened is her husband is an engineer at JPL, and she sent some of the books to the JPL bookstore, and like so many other people at JPL was going to do a book signing. They pulled the book off the shelf, they banned the book signing, they sent out a JPL white email, which I have a record of, trashing the book and how this was unacceptable. She fought back. She did get an apology. They refused to carry the book, and they said she can't do it because her husband is an employee of JPL. The book was then banned in the Seattle Science Museum section of space books that they had. Apogee, the publisher, had a huge display of all their books up there, and listeners were calling me and saying, why can't we find Laura's book? And it wasn't there, and the Apogee guys told me, well, it's an odd size, they couldn't show it. But the book was...
So what is your question, David?
No, it's just a comment to show what's happening. Then I have had the fun of interviewing about a half a dozen retired shuttle astronauts and station astronauts. The most fun is talking to them off air, and I ask them about sex on the shuttle and sex on the station, and most are pretty frank about it. Everyone to a letter says, look, we're so busy and we're so tired and there is so little privacy that the two environments that you're talking about, it would just be really unlikely to happen. But they do play bawdy tricks on each other. And you know, if you've got an all-military crew except for one woman on the crew, these guys play, you know, Air Force or Navy kind of jokes back and forth. But they have been very frank in saying the privacy, the lack of privacy and the schedules for work and the exhaustion that they go through would absolutely preclude it on the shuttle or the station, and but it's not far from their minds.
David, but you know, there must have been some other things I discussed in the last hour that regarding ethics.
I'd like to point out that the actual email at JPL, which I read, said that the book signing was abandoned for ethical reasons.
Right, thank you. Yeah, for ethical reasons.
This conference, I wanted to point that out. I think David Bixman's got a question.
Yeah, thank you for that.
This will be. Oh, we still got.
No.
I'm sorry to say this question has nothing to do with sex, but I'll ask it anyways. Let me rephrase this. No, you mentioned very briefly that things are handled differently in the Russian program, that they pay them and so forth. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about that. And then I'm curious, how were things done in the Soviet Union?
You mean in the Soviet Union as distinct from Russia?
Yes.
In the Soviet era, certainly all of the cosmonauts, with the exception possibly of Tereshkova, were from the military, and they were active service military. They did what they were told. They were under their, and that was an important factor. I don't know that that is still the case. In fact, I know of at least one person for whom that's not the case, a physician. One of the major differences, two major differences, one is in their preparation for flight. We tend to assign an astronaut to a flight, go through 6 months to 2 years of training on systems and on the experiment, and everything goes along, and that short of a medical emergency, they'll fly. The Russians are much more likely to pull someone off a flight at the last moment, very often because of a perceived medical difficulty, or because they don't qualify on one of their physiological tests. For example, they believe, and I think they're wrong, they believe in the efficacy of exposing people to a kind of a whirligig, a rotating device on a centrifuge, and see if you can stand it. It's sickening. And if you can't stand making the head movements that are required while rotating, my understanding is that you don't get to fly. So there is somewhat of the uncertainty in Star City about will you actually make it up to the flight. And there are a lot of changes of crews, or many more than we have up to the last minute. The biggest difference, however, is in the reward system. The astronauts are not paid, the cosmonauts are not paid very well. However, they have the opportunity to get bonuses for performance. And the bonus for the performance may be based upon being a subject in an experiment, which we don't do, being a subject in an experiment following the flight, and there have been a number of difficulties with getting the Russian participants to be volunteer experiments in U.S. experiments post-flight, with performing some activity for which they may or may not be fully trained or fully qualified, and there is some reason to think that part of the difficulty that led to the collision between the Progress cargo vehicle and the Mir, which nearly killed the Mir and the people in it, was associated with a tired subject who was insufficiently trained and incidentally didn't have all of the instrumentation that was required to build it up, but that he felt that he had to do this because some of his bonus was going to be dependent upon it. So those are some of the significant differences that I'm aware of.